Hi, Kevin.
Hey, Travis, can you hear me?
I can. I
Okay,
can hear
great.
you just fine. How are you?
Good. It's Thanks for meeting with me here.
Oh, absolutely.
Um, so Travis, you are the beer archaeologist. You're not a beer archaeologist, you're
Yeah,
the one. I don't
yeah,
find too many people like in your category of archaeology.
yeah.
So can you just briefly tell me about why you chose this
Sure,
uh,
absolutely.
area of
And
focus?
I will say preemptively, thank you for your patience in my response too, to get back to you. It's been a crazy start to the semester. So,
I assume you're a busy man, a lot
yeah.
busier than I am. So
Oh, no
I
worries.
want to get you back to it. I want to be cognizant of your time today too. I don't want to take
Sure.
away too much. So how much time do you have today?
I would
Um,
say, I've got another meeting at 10,
okay,
and
we'll
I just
stop
got to
right
do a little
before that,
prep. Okay, sounds great. Sounds
uh,
great, Kevin.
if
But
not sooner.
yeah, so I can give you a little background on like I've been teaching at the university in Boulder for it's my 14th year. So I've been there
Oh wow.
quite a long time. So I started teaching. I graduated from there in 2010 and then I got hired back basically right away. So I've been teaching Greek Roman archaeology, art history, Egyptology as well, which is something I picked up in like 2012, 2013. And now that's kind of become one of my more popular fields, I guess, student wise anyway. The students, it's one of my bigger classes. I teach it often. But I've been interested in brewing for a really long time. I actually started home brewing with my dad when I was about 19 years old and very curious about the process. And so when I graduated in 2010, I got hired back at CU, but it was on a part-time basis at that time. I was only teaching a few classes at a time for the first few years. So I decided to, you know, academia is great, but I'm like, I don't know if this is going to cut it. So I started looking for other occupations, and I worked for Apple for a while, and then I ended up leaving there and got a job at Avery Brewing Company here in Boulder. Um, because I've always wanted to brew. I've been brewing, like I said, since I was 19. So basically, that's a long time ago now, I guess 25 years.
Hmm.
Is that right? Am I doing the math right? Yes, 25 years I've been brewing. So, what happened was I didn't really expect my two fields to cross. Honestly, when I got done with grad school, I was focused primarily on Roman architecture and sculpture from the second century. So I mostly worked on basically Trajan through Marcus Aurelius was my
Oh
main
wow, yeah.
focus. But what happened was as I was becoming a brewer, the production manager at Avery realized that he's like, you're a teacher. We don't have anybody that teaches us anything about beer history. And we have these monthly meetings for the staff. Would you be willing to do little mini lectures on the history of beer? And I'm like, oh, sure, but I don't know anything about it. It's not really my forte. So you guys tell me what you want to learn about. And I'm sure I could dig up some research on a monthly basis and put something together. Well, that's basically how it sparked. And that started in 2012. And all of a sudden I realized as academics, we're always constantly scratching for how we're going to make our impact on the field because it's been around for so long, especially ancient archaeology
Yeah.
and the study of Greco-Roman material. And so I'm like, man, there might be something here in terms of working on beer. And then I realized that when you get way back to what I work on, no, hardly anybody globally works on stuff that old because it's so not tangible. Basically,
Right.
it's so vague, and you're having to do a lot of. It's a difficult study, right? Because we don't have literature typically on what's going on. We have to rely heavily on the art history and archaeology and ethnographic studies. So I started really intensely then diving into ancient beer production in about 2014, 2015, and that's what happened. I all of a sudden it like kind of just blew up overnight. I had worked my way up to being a manager at Avery, so I ran the research and development team at Avery, which meant that I could brew whatever I wanted. And so I started thinking, well, maybe I'll do a little academic research while I'm doing this too. And I started recreating some ancient beers. And within a few weeks of me releasing the first one, which was a Mycenaean beer, I had, NBC contacting me and
Oh
CNN,
wow.
all this stuff. And so, and then the Denver Museum of Nature and Science was wanting me to do stuff. And so I very much kind of shifted in that direction and went all in on beer archaeology and ancient beer history. And though I do focus quite intensely on the really old stuff. You probably, it looks like it sounded like from your email, you've looked into my stuff a little bit. So I do things all the way up to the 19th century as well. So I've done George Washington, Thomas Jefferson recreations. I've worked on original IPAs from the 18th century. Right now, I actually in my research brewery, which is right below my office down, it's in our third bay of our garage. I've got three batches of beer going, two of which are 18th century beers, and then I have two Homeric beers that are aging in ceramics in the basement right now. So,
Wow.
so that's kind of there's the full rundown, I guess you'd
Yeah,
say.
yeah, no, that's
But
great. I'm wondering. So, you talked about the intangibilities
yeah,
of brewing. So, I mean, similar to a recipe, like my execution of my grandmother's cookies isn't the same as my
right,
grandmother's execution. So,
right,
is that the intangible qualities that you're talking about? Is
yeah,
like the outcome of the ingredients?
definitely. And I think also where like I definitely am trying to recreate these historic ales, but I always, whenever I give my public lectures or anything, or even my students, I tell them that we're never going to be fully able to recreate what those foods or drinks were like. And it's because when it comes to food, as we all know, it's so reliant upon climate, equipment used, what was in the air that day, what was the barometric pressure, which changes fermentation on beers as well. And so, like what I'm trying to do is get as close as I can to it. But at the same time, as you pointed out, I feel like there's for every cook or brewer, there's an artistic license or there's that one little thing that somebody does different than somebody else that creates this slightly different outcome. And even in the modern world, I mean, I publish my recipes for beers and I did at Avery too. Avery, when I worked there, we published all of our recipes. And it's because, 1,000 people could go out with that exact same recipe and all try to produce that beer. And if we all came together to drink it, none of them are probably going to taste identical, right? And it's
Okay, yeah.
because water quality or mineral content, the gamut. You just throw it
Hmm.
at it. It's like, wow, that is a variable that will change the outcome. And so, and then with the tangibility too, you're right. I think one of the big pieces is that when we look at like I looked at your email just a few minutes ago that you sent me yesterday with what we were going to talk about, and yeah, like Gobekli Tepe, we don't have a recipe, right, for what they were brewing. In 18th dynasty Egypt, we don't have a full laid out like standard operating procedure, right, from the brewery on how they actually went about malting and or creating beer, which is what was in the article you sent me to about Akhenaten. That's a highly debated topic, whether or not they used this like loaf kind of thing and then fermented that, what's called Bapir from the ancient Near East. All of these variables that are somewhat not tangible because we don't just have a book we can pick up from the ancients and say, okay, yeah, they use these ingredients. This is the step-by-step process that they did it, right? And so there's a lot of inference that has to be made on the part of the analyst, but also I think one thing that hopefully I kind of bring to the study is because I've been a professional brewer now for 13 years, or no, is that right? 12 years now. Um, I think that hopefully adds an added layer because a lot of the people that get involved in these kind of studies are one or the other, right? They're the
Yeah,
academic who's lived in the books forever and knows every single text inside and out that's on the topic. And then you have the brewer who's brewed forever and knows how to brew today. But how do you put the two together, And
right.
so that's where, like with the company I started, the Beer Archaeologist, and then this research I do is hopefully trying to put the two together where I live in the books, but I also know how the beer is brewed,
Yeah,
the
that's my fascination with you, and I guess my first inclination to reach out to somebody who like studies this field was coming across Akhenaten. He's just a weird dude in history entirely.
absolutely,
But
absolutely,
the thing I wanted to focus on was like, uh, so the pharaohs were in charge of beer production, and that just seemed odd to me. Like
yeah,
from my understanding, Egypt wasn't a collectivist society, but they didn't have currency, so they had bits of gold and stuff that they would trade. They found value and they had some sort of relative value of everything figured out in their society.
Right.
But so if there was individualism, like why were the pharaohs in charge of the beer and bread production
Yeah,
specifically?
yeah, yeah. It's a great question, and it's also a pretty complicated thing. And actually, you could not have hit me at a better time because I'm literally teaching this in my food and alcohol class right now. We're this week we're covering Egyptian industrialization of food production, and this is something you might have come across it already, but you can look it up after we're done. There, back in 2021, so just a few years ago.
Mhm.
The largest brewery in Egypt was uncovered at Abydos, the Royal Cemetery. And what was quite striking about that facility is that starting in 2017, I was starting to formulate an argument that I've spoken about quite regularly, that I think that the Egyptians kind of get a bad rap sometimes because everybody wants to focus on Sumer as, the beginning of society, that everything that the Egyptians did was just borrowed from the Mesopotamians, which I definitely don't agree with for a lot of reasons. But one of the biggest ones has to do with the industrialization of food production, because we do know the Sumerians were producing a lot of beer, and we have a lot of archaeological evidence of what that looked like. But the Egyptians, from the evidence that was coming out in the 20 teens, it looked like there was probably a level of production that way outdid what the Sumerians were doing, that they were far more organized and even pre-dynastic locations. So maybe as early as like 3700, 3600 BCE at places like Hierakonpolis, or there's another location in the Delta called Tel El Farka, where we have evidence of breweries that were producing maybe 200 to 300 gallons of beer per day for the population.
Wow.
And that's a lot, right? And that would have probably been the ration. I think they've estimated, most of the estimates think it was a ration for a population of maybe 400 to 500 individuals at the site, because they're going to drink beer more than they are water, likely.
Hmm.
And so um, then all of a sudden in 2021, this huge facilities found at a royal cemetery, which we're still trying to figure that out. Like, why in the world is this in one dead, like, center Egypt, or it's a little bit further to the south, but it's basically out in the middle of nowhere, royal cemetery. And they were producing 5,000 gallon batches of beer,
Oh
and
yeah.
this at this huge installation. And what's even more fascinating about it is that it dates to 3000 BCE. So we're Dynasty One,
Wow.
were Narmer, basically, King Narmer, so we're at the very beginning of it. And so as we start working through industrialized processing of food and why kingship even arises in Egypt, like, why do pharaohs come about? I mean,
Yeah.
if there were already a population there, were these chiefdoms, and you have some kind of, elite component that rises up and creates the bureaucracy, and then you have a king? Or are the kings coming in from the outside, to try to usurp territory? And what I think is really fascinating, and again, this is all really new stuff because it's all just come out in the last couple of years, is that you have basically these commodities that are being controlled by a bureaucratic epicenter, right, or by some kind of very high positioned ruler, where they seem to be trying to usurp all the resources and bring it under their umbrella. So there's a theory, and I have to give a caveat to it. Not, and in the anthropological world, not everybody buys into this theory, but there was this anthropologist who you might have come across since you're doing some work in South America as well, in Bolivia. There's a guy named Robert Carniero. He was an anthropologist in the 1970s. He came up with this theory called circumscription, the circumscription theory, that argued that the reason you have these agricultural states that rise is because you have individuals like pharaohs that move in or rise up in the institution, and they limit mobility of the population, and then they start forcing the population to work for them. So most of his study was focused on ancient Peru, but at the end of his work, he very much said this could be applied to other pristine or premier civilizations in our
Yeah.
human history, Mesopotamia, Egypt being another one. And so if you have, and this brings it back to the food, how are they using it to sell and trade? Why are they controlling it? If there's anything to take away from his theory, I do think there's a lot of value in the idea that these kings rise in an environment that clearly is limited in mobility, right? You can't just escape to the desert and start growing there. You got to stay in the Nile Valley, right, or the
Right.
Delta.
Yeah.
And and we think pharaonic rule started in Upper Egypt and moved north. So it starts in the south and moves towards the delta. But when it arose, it probably was there to start saying, okay, all of you farmers are under my umbrella. You will pay me in taxation. I am going to start controlling bread and beer production. And though there might have been some mobility in the beginning where the farmers can move out of his bubble, eventually the bubble was all his, right? So eventually he
Yeah.
conquers all the way to the north. It's all under his umbrella. And then he starts taxing. And that's probably one of the more interesting and complicated pieces of the puzzle is the taxation piece, because we know that Egyptian kings, good kings, were taxing their people at about 10% of their yield. So they were required to pay in 10%, right,
When
of
you
grain.
say paying, oh, so you're saying the
Yeah.
grain. So
Yep.
that gets to the grain almost becoming a form of currency at that point.
Exactly. Exactly. And it seems that it was any commodity that was produced. And so if you were a clothes maker, like a linen
Yeah.
maker, you were required to pay in 10% of the linen you produced and wove that year in taxation. It would go into these large holds, these large granaries or warehouse systems that existed usually near where the capital was, whether it be Memphis or Thebes or any of the other, or Amarna, right?
Yeah.
Akhenaten. But he would hoard all that stuff. And then where his power was wielded was when the Nile didn't behave itself, because if they didn't get a good inundation and you had a drought or you had a flood, well, then the population's going to turn to their king and say, we need to be fed. And then that's where he's able to wield his power, right? Food, beer, bread is all power that he can wield over his people. So the commodities were essentially used as the currency, right? And beer would have been a currency. I mean, even the Pyramid Age in the Fourth Dynasty is where we have the richest evidence for it. But with the pyramids of Khufu and Khafre at Giza, we know that the labor force was paid in bread and beer. It
Hmm.
was their payment. So and to write that misnomer too, as I'm sure a lot of people think slaves built the pyramids, and they did not. They were paid laborers, but that was their currency. You come and work for us, and we will feed you. And then they were also given tax breaks. So if they were farmers, they could go back to their fields, and they wouldn't have to pay in as high of a yield at the end of the season.
Okay.
And so bread and beer play that huge role in that regard. And you're right, grain basically becomes a currency.
Okay, and this is a little off subject, but well, not off subject, but a little tangent. But you know how there's the Big Mac guy who's eating the Big Mac every day of
Yeah,
his life?
yeah, yeah.
So in ancient Egypt, beer would have been the purification of the water, really.
Sure.
So you can actually drink the water. Would would there have been people who, after they've gone off of their nursing period as a baby,
Mhm.
that drink beer from that moment till the moment they die, and probably just a diet of beer and bread only, like the Big Mac guy, and maybe just a
Sure.
little things? Is that possible in that time
It's
period?
it's possible, but I think a lot of more recent analysis of looking at not only the Egyptians, but a lot of the Mediterranean cultures and empires is starting to lean a little bit more in the direction that food was far more varietized for all levels of society than we often give it credit for. Now, that's not to say, I mean, certainly elites and royalty in Egypt are going to have more. They have essentially unlimited access to protein, right? So
Hmm.
nobody's going to tell the king or his royal family he can't have beef whenever he wants it, right?
Right.
And it was expensive. It was the most expensive food source in Egypt because it's expensive to rear. The farmers who actually were pastoralizing cattle, we know, were the wealthiest farmers, but also it comes at a huge expense. Those animals consume so much, right? So it's
Yeah.
costly to produce it. Therefore, it's expensive to sell. No different than today, right? Beef prices are off the charts when you go to the grocery store.
Yeah.
So so that piece is in play, but also one thing that's been overlooked, I think, until maybe the last couple of decades in the study of Egyptian food is how just rich the ecology is along the Nile Valley itself. And we have a lot of artistry that indicates your labor classes were netting fowl, so they were catching wild birds in large quantities for protein. Obviously, they were fishing the Nile and even the coastal region of the Mediterranean. There is also indication that they may have been pastoralizing ducks and geese as well, which is also going to be a huge component of Roman and Greek diets later on, where they're pastoralizing or pinning those fowl for protein. So they had protein source. It just wasn't always in a red meat sense.
Got
Um,
it.
and and even moving like to the Romans, for example, the Romans, they were huge consumers of pork. And I think often, and we know that basically everybody ate it, where almost all other cultures kind of, they didn't necessarily shun pork, but it wasn't a huge component of
Part
their
of the diet.
protein. Yeah, you look at the Romans, there were pig farms all over the place within a 20-mile radius of urban epicenters because that was basically as far as you could push your pack animals to bring in stuff to market on a daily basis. And there's been a couple of hog farms that have been found in recent excavation that promote that became a really economical source of protein for a very wide population in the Roman world as well.
Okay.
So you would have had a population, back to your question, you would have had a population that may have largely consumed bread and beer, but we also know, like you said, like the Big Mac guy, it's very unhealthy. They're I'm doing a lot of research right now on the Roman military, is why my brain keeps going
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
But the Roman military, we have evidence that of what the Roman military was consuming calorically on like a daily basis. Your average soldier would probably eat about 3,000 to 3,600 calories a day,
Wow.
and they a lot of the evidence we have says that it was 75% of that was grain. So they were eating like bread, and we're talking like 4 or 5 pounds of bread, some of them on a daily basis,
Yeah.
That's horrible for your diet. And but part of the problem with assuming that that's what they always ate is that sometimes we take the raw data too much at face value and don't look at the obvious things that are around them. I mean, if you feel like crap all the time because all you're doing is packing yourself full of carbohydrates, I think we all turn to something else, right? It's like, what
Yeah.
else can I eat? Where can I buy my food? Where can I catch it?
Just
And the ancients were certainly doing that regardless of social status. Yeah.
okay, that makes a lot of sense. So, switching to Gobekli Tepe, that's a site.
Hmm.
So many perspectives on that.
Yes.
I didn't think I was working on a visualization of Karhan Tepe, and I just assumed that everybody thought that it was a covered structure and it had a roof on top.
Sure.
And immediately when I started putting, support beams on top, people started yelling from the comments like, "There's no trees around there. There's, like, where's the lumbers? Where's evidence of lumber?"
Uh-huh.
And so I saw one of your talks where you go and talk about the Anatolian traders and talk about the difference of the climate back right after the Younger Dryas period, and
Yep.
and that fits with what I imagine the area would have looked like based upon the structures that I find there. But
Hmm.
what do you like? Where do you go to get good information about climate science or like
Yeah.
what the world looked like back in that time period?
Yep.
Um,
Fabulous question. And also something, again, your timing on that one was really good because it's something I've been focusing on a lot more in my own research as of late, because I would say up until maybe even like 2013, 2014, there was very poor data out there on what the climate really looked like, or what faunal or I should say even floral activity and evidence looked like post ice age, right? There was a
right.
lot of supposition made. I think one of the reasons, certainly, why it's become a more important study and a more avid study is obvious, right? We're going through it right now, where the climate change is so rampant, and we actually are physically seeing the effects of it right on a daily basis wherever we live. And so, um, early on, a lot of the evidence that I had was coming from fairly sporadic sources. University of Pennsylvania has put out a fair bit on climatology in the region because the Penn Classics department focuses so heavily on Near Eastern archaeology.
Yeah.
And so there's a few really good scholars and authors out of that institution. That's all they focus on, is early agriculture and climate or floral faunal evidence from, say, 10,000 BCE to 7,000 BCE.
Okay.
So that's where I first turned to start looking at things, but also looking just in general at patterns, looking mostly at archaeobotanical analyses of those regions, is where there's a fair bit of rich evidence that supports that what we see there today obviously is not what it was, even just maybe 10,000 years ago, around 8,000 BCE, let alone push it back another couple millennia, and the topography was vastly different. And so,
Okay.
as it currently stands, last ice age ended about 15,000 years ago, 13,000 BCE. And when that ice age ended, there is plenty of evidence that seems to support that Europe was heavily wooded, so it was large woodland cover everywhere, and that did extend into Anatolia. So essentially, all of Turkey and even Syria was heavily forested. Uh, what occurs though is then around it's right around about 9,000 to 8,500 BCE. The floral evidence shows no trees anymore, and what replaced them were wild grasses, which is why currently the evidence seems to support that einkorn actually, which was the original wheat, einkorn and barley in their wild forms propagated there and took place of all of this woodland in places like Syria, southeastern Turkey, where Göbekli Tepe is, located.
You're saying that the origins of what now has become wheat, it like started in specifically in that area. Oh
Yep,
wow. Okay.
exactly. Yeah, right now, as far as the evidence is presenting itself, we have yet to find any other older forms of Hordeum vulgare, which is wild barley, or Triticum vulgare, wild wheat,
Okay.
anywhere prior in any other location, other than that pocket of basically modern day Syria, and into just a section of Iran, like where Abu Huyera is, and those locations that are kind of in that borderland between Turkey, Iran, and Syria. And so now as a bit of a caveat and a tangent to that, there is some evidence that's come out about Egypt, way down south in Upper Egypt, really close to the cataracts, where there seems to be some kind of wild form of a barley or a wheat that was being cultivated by what was called the Kadan culture that thrived from like 13,000 to about 9,000 BCE. But because so far we can't tie the two grass sources together, it doesn't seem that whatever was down there is the same kind of wheat barley that was thriving in Syria. And whatever it was, clearly, basically, what's the word, went extinct. It's gone. And
Okay.
what was growing in Syria is what we as a species decided we're going to harvest and start domesticating. And it's created all the barley and wheat we have today. It all comes from Syria, from
So
that
as
look.
a beer archaeologist, you're also a grain and cereal
Yeah,
archaeologist too.
absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so what is the evidence then that you look at, like you said, bioarchaeological evidence?
Yeah.
What does that look like when you're finding evidence of grain? How do you know that this is a cultivated grain versus a
Oh, yeah.
in the ground? Like,
Fabulous question. So yes, I rely heavily on archaeobotany. It's certainly where I start. Now, one thing I do have to say about it, though, as you note in the work you do, we can't always just rely on that, though, right? Because sometimes we can get so misled by the science,
hmm
or we might misinterpret the data because it's such a minute population, right? We might be looking at like one cup or one pot, and we're trying to figure out what was in it. And we're like, oh my God, we know exactly what's in there. There's a recipe. Well, no, we can't go that far sometimes. But with the archaeobotany, with the collecting of, it can be wild seeds. It can also be literally like an ancient form of like a coffee mug or vessel. They slough off a piece of clay on the inside, and they'll run what we call gas chromatography on it. Gas chromatography will kick back a genetic marker of all of the carbon-based items that are in that vessel, and that'll give you an idea of what was in the container. Now, this is where we do have to be cautious, though. Like you've probably come across Patrick McGovern in
hmm
a little bit of your exploration. He's at Penn. He's retired now, but he was kind of the first guy to get into this whole like, how do we recreate ancient beers or wines back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And he did a lot of that early gas chromatography, and he would get all this genetic marker of everything that was in the vase. The problem with using that data, though, is that supposes a couple of things. One, it supposes that whatever you found in that piece of clay was definitely the last ingredients that were in the very last thing that went into that container. And it assumes that it has not been contaminated by the environment over the thousands of years since it was put in the ground, which we can't make that assumption, right? The other big assumption that's often made when we use all that archaeobotanical data is basically that everything was a single use vessel, which we know is not true. It'd be like, okay, I just finished my soda. I'm going to earn, well, soda bottles unfortunately get tossed. Let's say I just finished my beer, right, out of a pint glass. I'm going to throw the pint glass away. And of course, they didn't do that. So they kept
Yeah.
using these vessels over and over for various things. So all that stuff's going to get deeply embedded in the clay. Regardless, it's a good starter because it gives us an idea of what was in the pot at various times or what was in the container at various times. Looking at seeds, though, collection of actual floral evidence, that is, actually looking at the seeds themselves, how we can tell the difference between wild versus cultivate or wild versus domesticated is actually in the shape of the seeds themselves. So they can be run genetically to identify with specificity that this is, in fact, this type of wheat. But what we need usually, and this doesn't always occur, is where it's really nice if at the same site we can find both wild and domesticated side by side, because not only can you compare the two, right? What's
Yeah.
going on behind me? Oh,
I don't
there's
know.
a
Yeah. It's some sort of
I got
automatic filter.
that was
It was good. It
interesting.
was
I don't
good.
know.
It was good. It was
Zoom's got new
appropriate.
things now. Yeah. That was amazing. I don't
Yeah.
even know how that happened. But anyway, it's got uh you've got comparisons, right? Then so you can look at the exact same seed in the same location, say, okay, we have like Hordeum vulgare. We've got what looks like wild barley, but the wild ones will usually be really long, thin, almost needle-like seeds. And then domesticated are going to be fat. They're really bulbous and fat little seeds.
Mm.
And that's a nice marker of comparison.
But when you have the both there, yeah,
Right. Now I
yeah.
should say right now the best location for this here, I'll type it in the chat if you want to look it up, is a place called Abu Huyera.
Okay.
It's because unfortunately we can't do anything there anymore because it's not in a place that wants us there currently.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
There's a lot of
so
sites
it's
like that
right.
now.
Yeah, they're in Iran, so it's in a
Okay.
portion of Iran, close to the Syrian border. But Abu Huyera was a place that was extensively analyzed and studied in the 80s and 90s. And actually, the lead archaeologist is still alive who did it. He just did a talk for the American Research Center in Egypt like last year about his early research. But we actually have evidence there of hunter-gatherers living side by side with agriculturalists. And because they're, I think
Oh,
it's
there
when I
you
do
go.
the thumbs up.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a thumbs up thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Okay.
So when we have them living in the same pocket at the same time, so we can actually analyze what wild seeds look like next to domesticated seeds at that site. What's also critically topic for a different conversation, but what's really cool about it is we can actually see what happened to our species when we stopped hunting and gathering, because we have osteological evidence of sedentary hunter-gatherers next to sedentary agriculturalists. And the bone evidence from the hunter-gatherers, they were far healthier than the
Bigger
agriculturalists.
people too, and
Bigger people, solider or more rigid bone structure. You can tell they were consuming far more amino acids in their diet, and it's primarily because they were still hunting and eating wild game as opposed to domesticated proteins. You can actually track the shift in our species that occurs right around
wow,
that
yeah,
time. It's
I
awesome.
I won't go into that today, but like I want to
Yeah,
come back. I want to reserve the
yeah,
right to come back to you on that.
yeah, absolutely. You bet. Absolutely.
I just one last because I'm warming. You saw the video, or I saw the
Yeah,
indication of Puma Punku.
yeah.
So
It's
they're
awesome. I just watched it. It's
oh,
really
thank you,
cool what you're doing. Yeah, that's really, really cool.
thank you. So beer came out like literally every site that I would work on like Gobekli Tepe. I guess they found like what you're saying. Just finishing that thought. So at Gobekli Tepe, they probably found a container, and then they did the biological
Right.
archaeology on the
Right.
side of the container, and then
Yeah,
that's what they assume is the beer
that's what they're
production.
assuming currently.
Okay.
Yeah. So with Göbekli Tepe, they there was kind of just an assumption for a long time that beer was probably being produced there because we don't have the oldest evidence for wine production dates to about 6500 BCE, and it's in Georgia, so in the Caucasus, and we have no indication that they were doing large scale wine production at all, or even like small scale. At the time, Göbekli Tepe was constructed. And so beer seems to have been kind of the main staple that they probably would have been consuming. And of course, as you know, at Göbekli Tepe, it's not a community, right? It's not a town. It's some kind of religious or ancestral worship site that these nomadic peoples were coming to on a regular basis. What was found at the site were a couple of these stone containers that are about 42 gallons in size that were debated on whether or not they were used for bread or beer production. I don't really understand the argument that they're for bread because I don't know what you need a 42-gallon container for bread. That's a massive loaf of bread, right? So what are we going to do with it? But what they eventually found, there was a paper published, I believe it was in 2019, and then it was revisited in 2021, where they had actually found oxalates in the vessel. So as opposed to them doing gas chromatography, what they found around like kind of a mark on the inside of the pot or the container were oxalates that are there that are known to have been produced when you convert basically grain-based sugars and starches to alcohol.
Wow.
And we have it today. I fight it in my brewery because we call it beer stone. So beer stone will build up in your vessels when you use them repeatedly over and over and over again. And it's a pain in the butt to scrub it out. You have to use, today we use fairly harsh chemicals to get it out. They would have never done that in
Yeah,
antiquity.
yeah, that makes sense.
And it's actually the same component that kidney stones are formed out. It's the exact same compound.
Okay.
And so that's what they found. And it, to me, that's like, it's a dead ringer because I
Yeah,
don't know why else it would be there, you
right.
know?
What other
So
process would have created that? Yeah, right.
exactly. And
Okay.
so, and then that's, that's a whole other conversation to be had too, because if they're producing that much beer, these are nomadic hunter-gatherers, they're coming here for some kind of ancestral worship. Where's the grain coming from, right? This is clearly still in its wild phase. So are these peoples coming back with, just baskets of grain that they foraged for a communal festival to their ancestors or whatever it might be? How is beer playing a role as like as you discussed, everywhere you go, beer seems to link all of humanity together. And it's interesting. I think it's so cool. It's why I love studying beer is it is such a communal thing. Like they decided they're going to come to this site for something important. And what do they consume together? Beer, right? And it's like I tell my students, like when I'm at home and I want a glass of scotch, I don't want anybody to talk to me, right? I'm sitting drinking my scotch and we read a
Yeah,
book.
right.
If I'm having a glass of wine, I'll do it with my wife, and we have a conversation. But beer,
Beer as a community.
it's a
Yeah,
communal thing, right?
yeah.
And it's always been that way. Yeah.
So then going to Puma Punku,
Yeah.
the chicha that they drank there,
Yeah.
it's corn-based, right?
Yep.
Alcohol or
Yep.
so do you think it's any different than any of the other beers that that you find, or how do you view chicha versus all the
Yeah.
other beers and alcohol?
Yeah. Great question. Chicha is definitely just like another style of beer in my opinion. I have produced chicha before. As one of the when I was doing the Elves of Antiquity series at Avery, we did one from ancient Peru. And one thing that I think with beer, I've been working on this a lot lately, even in a legal capacity at the federal level for like how we define beer because of what's
Oh,
going on in the industry right now. And beer just needs a fermentable sugar source, right? So that's really all that's required. And why so much of it comes from wheat and barley is because the cultures that first created beer in the Near East or in the West, that was their primary source. They could get the starches out, convert it to sugar, yeast eats it, converts it to alcohol, right? So, but you need the sugar for the yeast to eat. And so globally, wherever you go, they were figuring out and finding different types of commodities to use as a sugar source. Far East is using rices, right? Or eventually sugar cane or cane sugars. Maize or corn widely available in South America and in North America as well. So it was used as a source for that fermentable sugar. So it is a beer through and through. I think it's more of a process thing. To identify it as a beer, you need to brew it and ferment it. So it needs to be heated to cause some kind of conversion or gelatinization of the sugars into a liquid form so the yeast can eat it, convert it to alcohol. So it is a beer style basically. Now, in terms of how it tastes, though, it's sour. It's but not to the scale of like a sour beer that you get like a barrel aged sour beer from a brewery today. It's really quite tart. So it's more if you've had like gozas before, like the
mhm.
German style goza, which is a
Okay.
kind of a tart beer. It's a little tartar than that, but it's because you're largely relying on wild bacteria and yeast to do the fermentation, which are going to create these souring markers. Um, of course, the big thing that makes chicha different, though, in the process is traditionally it's chewed. So the corn is chewed and then it's spit into a container. And this goes well back into like we have evidence of it probably at least 600 CE, so 1400 years ago, if not well before in the Indo-American peoples, that
Oh,
they would
wow.
chew it up. Now, what's really cool, and I mean, this is what I love to tell my students is we too often, right, just assume the ancients were dumb and didn't know what they were
Yeah.
doing. They're just fumbling through life, and we know that's not true.
Yeah.
They're probably smarter than we are in a lot of ways, because they rely on technology to do a lot of stuff,
Yeah,
And
definitely in certain areas. They know how
yeah,
to stonework better than we do.
oh
So
my God, it's incredible. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah, as I was just watching your video is so cool. I'm like, yeah, how did they figure out like those H blocks? I was watching you move the H blocks over
Yeah.
the pieces. I'm like, the thought that goes into all of this design and stuff with such rudimentary tools, right?
Yeah.
Uh, just shows their intelligence. But the reason they chewed the corn is because we all produce enzymes in our saliva, and one in particular is alpha amylase. And alpha amylase will, in corn, it actually starts the enzymatic conversion of the cornstarch to sugar. And it's actually been tracked
Wow.
in the population globally, like of analyzing alpha amylase content or levels in our saliva. South American peoples and some Far East Asian peoples have a much higher alpha amylase content in their saliva than Europeans do. Well, what were they producing down there? Chichas, where they had to chew the corn. And then we think that in Far Eastern Asian countries, some nationalities were chewing the rice to cause the same kind of enzymatic
Wow.
conversion to make beer. And it's kind of cool. Like you can do a mouth swab even of like a population around here, and you'll see all these different alpha amylase levels. And if you start tracking back their ancestry, usually the people that have high alpha amylase are from South America or the Far East, which is
That's
amazing.
fascinating.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
so cool. And so early on, they figured out, well, I chew this, and during the mastication process, I'm injecting those enzymes into the starches that are starting to enzymatically convert it to sugar. I spit it into a container, I let it sit, and they let it sit usually for like a day, and then they boil it. So it's going to kill anything that's, nasty in our mouths, any kind of bacteria, it's all killed.
Yeah.
And then they ferment it.
Wow.
And that's where the chicha comes from. And again, communal. It was almost
Yeah.
exclusively women doing the process. They would make the beer, they'd chew it, spit it in these containers, and then when it was done, you gathered to drink it. Even today in South America, chicha producers will put like a flag on the front of their homes, or they'll put a little red flag out that's just to mark to the community that hey, we got fresh chicha, come on by, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's still a communal thing, thousands of years later.
Well, I don't want to take up any more of your time. I'm cognizant of the time here. You got about like 15 minutes before
Yeah.
10 o'clock. So
Yep.
I want to let you go here, but I want to reserve the right to come back to you because I'm going to probably get
Absolutely,
more
Kevin.
questions in the future.
Absolutely.
And if somebody in the meantime wants to see more about your work or see more about you,
Sure.
where do they go?
Yeah, so they can follow me on Instagram at the Beer Archaeologist. You
Okay.
can also contact me through my website, thebeerarchaeologist.com. And then I am full-time faculty at University of Colorado Boulder, so I'm doing stuff all the time, doing a lot of public lectures and things as well, and things like this with you too, Kevin. So I always post these things on my social media channels in that regard.
Okay. Well,
Yep,
thank you very much today.
absolutely, Kevin. Thank
Yeah,
you.
it
It's a
was
good
great to talk to you.
conversation.
Yeah.
Feel free to hit me back anytime.
I
And
will definitely, I
sure.
won't abuse it, but I'm definitely going to use that again. So
Yeah, yeah, you should. And your work is so interesting. I
thank
think
you.
it's so cool. Yeah, that I had no idea that was kind of when you contacted me first off and said you're an artist. I'm like, well, this is cool. Like, what's he doing? And then you were talking about the facial reconstructions, but the fact it sounds like you found a really cool niche too, where you're doing these recreations for archaeological sites and things, and that's awesome.
Yeah,
So
I'd like to hear where I should be directed towards in the future too from you. So yeah, I'm
yeah,
going to
I
look up that site
do
that
it.
you,
Yeah,
yeah, but
because
I'm
I think
fascinated
for
with
what
that.
yeah, yeah. I think what what you're working on, I mean, as you know, it's become a big thing in the classics field, really, or just ancient archaeology is use of technology, video game technology, all of these kinds of things, artistry to recreate the past. I mean, my students are constantly telling me about Assassin's Creed, this video
Yeah.
game.
Yeah.
God, the team that they have that works on that, the
Yeah.
research they do. Like I even show like a 20-minute clip of a guy playing one of the games at Olympia because they reconstructed the Olympic Stadium at Olympia like perfectly from all this research. I'm like, it's
Yeah, the
cool what
technology has
artists can
gotten to the
do.
point where, like, I've been in 3D technology for a number of years. I was a toy designer and stuff, but the 3D technology has gotten to the point where you can have an entire, like, that Puma Punku video is done
Yeah,
1-to-1 size. Those H blocks are 1-to-1 size in my computer, and I'm moving around in real time. And 20 years ago, when I started down this process of like learning 3D technology and CAD and all that stuff, it was so clunky and cumbersome. And
sure.
probably with Unreal Engine, I mean, I started on Unreal Engine 1, I think it was 1998. I came home from college and got the first version of Unreal Engine. It's like a gaming engine that you
Sure.
could like play with and put your own characters in. And now on Unreal Engine 5, it's like you can control the sun. It's just a command, Control L, and I can shift the sun in the sky. I can build everything 1-to-1 size. It just blows me away. And before this, I did like a solid career of like pop culture. So I was a toy designer, pop culture, and I so all these stories I know about like pop culture, I'm just at the point in my life where it's I want to know real stuff.
Yeah.
and,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and the stories about archaeology, the stories about our history is more interesting to me now at this
Sure.
point in my life than
Yeah.
knowing facts and data about Star Wars characters. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel
Yeah.
I've run the gamut on that. So this
Fair.
is my
Fair.
area of focus now. So
Oh, well, I love Star Wars too, though. That's so cool.
I love observing it as a fan now, not
Yeah.
being
Yeah. Yeah.
involved with it as a
That's fair.
career anymore. So,
That's
but
fair.
yeah, I won't talk anymore about it. Like I said,
No,
I
that sounds
really
awesome,
appreciate the
Kevin.
time. So
It was
we'll
my
talk to you
pleasure.
soon.
Reach out anytime. I'd love to chat with you again. Okay.
Cool. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Take care, Kevin.
Bye.
Bye.